The rain had been falling all evening, turning the city streets into dark mirrors that reflected the glow of streetlights. It was March 15th, 1997, and Richard Blackwood sat in his luxury car, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had turned white. The engine was still running, but he couldn't bring himself to drive home. Not yet. In the passenger seat beside him lay a small bundle wrapped in a hospital blanket. Inside was his 3-day-old daughter, born just hours ago. In a private clinic across town, the baby made soft cooing sounds, completely unaware that her life hung in the balance of one man's desperate decision. Richard was 42 years old and had everything most people could only dream of. His real estate company owned half the downtown buildings. His bank account had more zeros than most people could count. Politicians called him for advice. Business leaders sought his approval. He lived in a mansion that had been featured in magazines, drove cars that cost more than most people's houses, and wore suits that cost more than many people made in a month. But tonight, all of that felt worthless. Tonight, he felt like a man, standing on the edge of a cliff, watching his carefully built life crumble beneath his feet. The baby's mother, Maria, had been his secretary for 2 years. She was 24, smart and beautiful in a way that made men stop and stare when she walked into a room. What started as innocent flirting during late office hours had turned into secret meetings. Those meetings had led to romantic dinners in hotels where no one would recognize them. And those dinners had led to this moment. Richard had been married to Catherine for 15 years. She was the daughter of a judge, connected to all the right families in the city. Their marriage had opened doors for Richard that his money alone never could have. Together they had built not just wealth but social standing. Catherine hosted charity events that raised millions. She sat on the boards of hospitals and museums. She was his ticket into a world where real power lived. 3 months ago, Maria had knocked on his office door with tears in her eyes and news that would destroy everything. She was pregnant. Richard's first instinct had been to offer money for her to quietly disappear to handle the situation somewhere far away. But Maria surprised him. She wanted to keep the baby. She talked about being a mother, about giving the child a good life. She even suggested that maybe, someday, Richard could be part of that life too. Richard had felt panic rise in his chest like cold water. Catherine could never know. His business partners could never know. The city council members who were considering him for mayor could never know. In their social circle, scandal wasn't just embarrassing. It was deadly. People had lost everything, for less. So he had convinced Maria to keep quiet, at least until he could figure out what to do. He had paid for her medical bills and given her money for expenses. He had told himself he was buying time to find the right solution. But deep down, he knew there was no right solution. There were only degrees of disaster. Then, 2 weeks ago, Catherine had found a receipt. It was for flowers, expensive ones, that Richard had sent to Maria during her pregnancy. When Catherine confronted him, Richard had panicked and lied badly. He claimed it was for a business associate's wife who had been in the hospital. But Catherine was smart. She hired a private investigator. The investigator had followed Richard to the hospital the night Maria gave birth. He had photographs of Richard holding the baby. He had documented every visit, every payment, every lie. When Catherine received the report, she didn't scream or cry or throw things. She simply sat Richard down in their living room and laid out her terms. Divorce, she said, would cost him half of everything. She would make sure every newspaper in the city knew why. She would tell her father, the judge, and all their influential friends exactly what kind of man Richard really was. His business would suffer. His political dreams would die. His reputation would be destroyed. But there was an alternative. If the problem disappeared completely, if there was no baby, no scandal, no evidence, then Catherine would pretend none of this had ever happened. They could go back to their perfect life. Richard could still run for mayor. They could still attend charity galas and smile for the cameras. But the problem had to disappear. All of it. Richard had stared at his wife, shocked by the coldness in her voice. This was the woman who donated to children's charities, who smiled warmly at cameras while cutting ribbons at hospital openings. yet she was asking him to make a newborn baby disappear. For 3 days, Richard had wrestled with the decision. He had visited Maria and the baby at the hospital, holding his daughter and feeling something he hadn't expected: love. The baby was beautiful, with dark hair like her mother and eyes that seemed to look right through him. When she grabbed his finger with her tiny hand, Richard felt his heart break a little. But every time he returned home, Catherine would be there with that cold smile and those calculating eyes. She would remind him of everything he stood to lose. His company employed 300 people. His investments supported dozens of other businesses. His charitable donations funded scholarships and medical research. Was he really going to throw all of that away for one mistake? The baby had been discharged from the hospital that morning. Maria was staying with her sister across town, afraid to go back to her own apartment because she knew Catherine might have people watching her. Richard had convinced Maria to let him take the baby for a few hours, claiming he wanted to introduce her to his lawyer to discuss financial arrangements. Maria had trusted him. She had kissed the baby goodbye and handed her over with a smile, believing that Richard was finally ready to do the right thing. The trust in her eyes had made Richard feel sick, but he had taken the baby anyway. Now he sat in his car at Willow Lake, 20 minutes outside the city. It was a place he had come to fish as a child with his grandfather. Back then, it had seemed peaceful and pure. Tonight, it looked dark and forbidding under the cloudy sky. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy with moisture. Richard got out of the car and walked to the water's edge, carrying the sleeping baby. His expensive shoes slipped slightly on the wet grass. The lake stretched out before him, black as ink under the moonless sky. He could hear small waves lapping gently against the shore. He stood there for a long time holding his daughter and trying to find the courage to do what he believed he had to do. The baby stirred in his arms and opened her eyes. In the dim light, she seemed to be looking directly at him. For a moment, Richard thought about getting back in the car and driving away. Not home, but somewhere far away where they could both start over. But then he thought about Catherine's ultimatum. He thought about his business, his reputation, his future. He thought about all the people who depended on him, all the responsibilities he carried. He told himself he was making a sacrifice for the greater good, that sometimes good people had to make terrible choices. Richard closed his eyes, whispered a prayer asking for forgiveness, and threw his 3-day-old daughter into the dark water of Willow Lake. The baby hit the water with a splash that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Richard watched the ripples spread outward, then forced himself to turn away. He walked back to his car, got in and drove home to his wife, leaving his daughter to drown in the cold, dark lake. What Richard didn't know was that he wasn't alone at Willow Lake that night. Thomas Chen had been fishing at Willow Lake for 37 years. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, rain or shine, he would pack his simple gear and drive his old pickup truck to the same quiet spot on the eastern side of the lake. At 62 years old, Thomas wasn't the kind of man who liked crowds or noise. The lake gave him peace after long days working at the auto repair shop he owned with his brother. That March evening, Thomas had arrived later than usual. His truck had broken down earlier in the day, and he'd spent hours fixing it before he could make the 20-minute drive to his favorite fishing spot. The rain had just stopped when he launched his small rowboat into the dark water. He preferred fishing from the boat because it kept him away from the occasional teenagers who came to the lake to party. Thomas had been casting his line for about an hour when he heard a car engine in the distance. He looked toward the main parking area and saw headlights but didn't think much of it. Sometimes young couples came to the lake at night, though usually not on rainy weekdays like this. He went back to his fishing, enjoying the quiet sounds of water lapping against his boat. The fish weren't biting much, but Thomas didn't mind. For him, fishing was more about the silence and the chance to think than about actually catching anything. After working all day with the constant noise of power tools and car engines, the lake felt like a different world. About 20 minutes later, Thomas heard a car door slam. He looked up again and saw a figure walking toward the water's edge. Even in the dim light, Thomas could tell this person was well-dressed. The man's clothes looked expensive, and he moved like someone who wasn't used to walking on wet grass and uneven ground. Thomas was curious, but not alarmed. Sometimes people came to the lake just to think or to get away from their problems. Living in a small city, Thomas had learned that rich people had troubles too, even if those troubles were different from his own. But then Thomas saw something that made his blood run cold. The well-dressed man was carrying something small in his arms, something wrapped in a blanket. And from the way he was holding it, the careful way he supported it, Thomas knew exactly what it was. A baby. Thomas set down his fishing rod and watched in horror as the man stood at the water's edge for several long minutes, holding the bundle and seeming to struggle with some internal decision. Thomas wanted to call out, to ask if everything was okay, but something about the man's posture told him this wasn't a normal situation. Then, without warning, the man raised his arms and threw the bundle into the lake. Thomas heard the splash even from 50 yards away. For a moment he couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. His mind tried to find other explanations. Maybe it was just clothes or garbage or anything other than what he feared it was. But deep in his heart, Thomas knew the truth. The man, in expensive clothes, stood at the shore for a few more seconds, then turned and walked quickly back to his car. Thomas heard the engine start and watched the headlights disappear into the night. Then everything was quiet again, except for the gentle sound of water moving in the darkness. Thomas had been in the Navy 20 years earlier, during the Vietnam War. He had seen terrible things and had learned to act quickly in emergencies. All of that training kicked in now. Without hesitation, he started rowing toward the spot where he had seen the bundle hit the water. His old boat moved slowly through the dark lake, and Thomas felt panic rising in his chest. How long could a baby survive in cold water? How long had it already been? The March night was chilly and the lake water would be even colder. Every second counted. When Thomas reached the area where he thought the bundle had landed, he could barely see anything in the darkness. He used his flashlight to scan the surface of the water, looking for any sign of the blanket or movement. The lake was deeper here than near the shore, maybe 8 or 10 feet deep. Just when Thomas was beginning to lose hope, he saw something pale floating just below the surface. He reached into the cold water, soaking his jacket sleeve, and grabbed what felt like fabric. He pulled up a hospital blanket heavy with water, and inside was the most beautiful baby girl he had ever seen. The baby wasn't moving, and her skin looked blue in the flashlight beam. Thomas's heart sank. Was he too late? He pulled the baby from the wet blanket and held her against his chest, trying to warm her with his own body heat. She felt so cold, so still. Then, miraculously, the baby made a small sound. It wasn't quite a cry, more like a weak whimper, but it was the most wonderful sound Thomas had ever heard. She was alive. Thomas rowed back to shore faster than he had ever rowed before. His hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline, but he managed to get the boat to the bank and carry the baby to his truck. He wrapped her in his own jacket and turned the heater on full blast. The baby was breathing, but barely. Her lips were still blue, and she felt dangerously cold. Thomas knew he had to get her to a hospital immediately. The nearest one was 15 minutes away if he drove fast and didn't hit any red lights. As he drove through the empty streets, Thomas's mind raced. Who was the man who had thrown this baby into the lake? Why would anyone do such a horrible thing? And what should Thomas tell the doctors when he arrived at the hospital? Thomas was a simple man who fixed cars for a living. He wasn't educated, or wealthy, or connected to important people. The man at the lake had looked rich and powerful. What if Thomas tried to report what he had seen and no one believed him? What if the man had enough money and influence to make trouble for Thomas? But as Thomas looked at the tiny baby girl wrapped in his jacket, slowly warming up and starting to make stronger sounds, he knew none of that mattered. This child needed help, and he was the only person who could provide it right now. At the hospital, Thomas told the emergency room staff that he had found the baby floating in the lake while he was fishing. He said he didn't know how she had gotten there or who she belonged to. The doctors and nurses were focused on saving the baby's life, so they didn't ask too many questions at first. The baby was rushed into the emergency room, where doctors worked, to warm her body temperature and check for any injuries. Thomas waited in the lobby, still wearing his wet clothes and smelling like lake water. After about an hour, a doctor came out to tell him that the baby was going to be okay. She had been in the water for only a few minutes, and while she was cold and scared, she hadn't suffered any permanent damage. A police officer arrived to take Thomas's statement about finding the baby. Thomas stuck to his story about discovering her while fishing, but he could tell the officer was suspicious about some of the details. How exactly had a newborn baby ended up in a lake? Where were her parents? Why hadn't anyone reported her missing? Thomas answered the questions as best he could without lying outright, but he didn't mention seeing the well-dressed man. He told himself he needed time to think about what to do with that information. The truth was, he was scared. The man at the lake had tried to kill this baby, and people who could do such things were dangerous. After giving his statement, Thomas was told he could go home. The baby would be placed in protective custody while social services tried to figure out who she was and where she belonged. If no family came forward, she would eventually be placed with a foster family. Thomas drove home in his old truck, thinking about the tiny life he had saved. He wondered what would happen to her now, whether she would find a good family, whether she would grow up happy and safe. He also thought about the man at the lake and whether justice would ever be served for what he had tried to do. As Thomas pulled into his driveway, he made a decision that would haunt him for the next 27 years. He would keep quiet about what he had really seen that night. He would let the baby start fresh with a new family, without the shadow of that terrible night hanging over her. But he would never forget, and someday when the time was right, he would make sure the truth came out. Thomas had no way of knowing that the baby he saved would grow up to become one of the most respected prosecutors in the state, or that she would spend her career fighting for justice for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He couldn't predict that his decision to save her life would eventually lead to justice being served in ways he never could have imagined. All Thomas knew was that he had done the right thing by pulling that baby from the cold, dark water. Whatever happened next, at least she would have a chance to live. Elena Rodriguez opened her eyes on her 18th birthday in the small bedroom she shared with her younger foster sister. The morning sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of the modest two-bedroom house where she had lived for the past 4 years. As she lay there listening to the sounds of her foster mother preparing breakfast in the kitchen, Elena thought about how different her life might have been if the Hartwell family hadn't taken her in when she was 14. Before the Hartwells, Elena had bounced between 7 different foster homes. Some families had been kind but overwhelmed. Others had been in it just for the monthly checks from the state. A few had been genuinely loving but couldn't handle Elena's fierce independence and burning questions about justice and fairness that seemed to consume her even as a young child. Elena had always been different from other kids. While they played with dolls or video games, she watched court shows on television with intense focus. When other children complained about unfair treatment from teachers or parents, Elena would spend hours thinking about why some people had power over others, and whether that power was being used correctly. The Hartwells were different from her previous families. David Hartwell taught high school history, and his wife Linda worked as a nurse at the county hospital. They had tried for years to have children of their own before deciding to become foster parents. When Elena arrived at their home as an angry, defensive teenager who had been through too much disappointment, they didn't try to change her or fix her. Instead, they gave her books to read and encouraged her questions about how the world worked. Linda would often tell Elena about her work at the hospital, how she fought to make sure poor patients received the same quality care as wealthy ones. David shared stories from history about ordinary people who had stood up against injustice and changed the world. Without realizing it, they were feeding Elena's natural hunger for justice and showing her that one person really could make a difference. In high school, Elena threw herself into her studies with an intensity that worried some of her teachers. She took every advanced class available and spent her free time in the library reading law books and court cases. Her guidance counselor suggested she might want to consider other interests, maybe join some clubs or try dating like other teenagers. But Elena felt like she was running out of time, though she couldn't explain why. The truth was, Elena had always felt like something was missing from her life. She couldn't remember anything from her first few years, which wasn't unusual for someone who had been through trauma. But there was something deeper, a feeling that she was meant to be somewhere else, doing something important. When she read about prosecutors who took on powerful criminals, or judges who protected the innocent, she felt a recognition that she couldn't explain. Elena's grades were perfect, but the Hartwells worried about money for college. David's teacher, salary and Linda's nursing income were enough to support their household, but college tuition was expensive. Elena applied for every scholarship she could find, writing essay after essay about her desire to study law and fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. One essay question asked her to describe a person who had inspired her. Elena wrote about someone she called the unknown hero, the person who had saved her life when she was found as a baby at Willow Lake. She didn't know who it was or why they had been there that night, but she wrote about how someone had cared enough to pull her from the water and give her a chance at life. That essay won her a full scholarship to the state university. College was the first place where Elena felt like she truly belonged. Her professors in political science and pre-law noticed her immediately. She wasn't just smart, she had a passion for justice that burned brighter than anything they had seen in years of teaching. Elena devoured every assignment and asked for extra reading. She joined the debate team in the mock trial competition, where she quickly became known for her ability to argue cases involving corruption and abuse of power. During her sophomore year, Elena volunteered at a legal aid clinic that helped poor families with housing disputes and custody battles. It was there that she first saw how the legal system could be twisted to favor people with money and connections over those who had neither. Elena watched wealthy landlords use expensive lawyers to evict families who couldn't afford legal representation. She saw custody cases where one parent hired high-powered attorneys, while the other couldn't even afford to take time off work for court hearings. These experiences lit a fire in Elena that would drive everything she did for the rest of her life. She began to understand that the law was only as good as the people who enforced it, and that real justice required someone willing to fight for it every single day. Elena graduated from college at the top of her class and was accepted to law school with another full scholarship. Law school was brutal. 18-hour days of reading cases, writing papers, and preparing for exams that could determine her entire future. But Elena thrived under the pressure. She found her calling in criminal law, particularly in cases involving crimes against children and corruption by public officials. Her professors noticed that Elena seemed to have an almost personal connection to cases involving child abandonment and abuse. She would stay up all night researching precedents, finding angles that other students missed and crafting arguments that judges found compelling. When asked why these cases mattered so much to her, Elena would simply say that children deserved someone to fight for them. During her final year of law school, Elena did an internship with the district attorney's office. She was assigned to work on minor cases, petty theft, small drug possession charges, traffic violations. But Elena approached even these simple cases with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She researched the defendants' backgrounds, looked for patterns in the charges, and began to notice something troubling. Many of the people being prosecuted were poor, minority, or both. Meanwhile, Elena rarely saw wealthy defendants facing charges for white-collar crimes that affected far more people and involved much more money. When she asked her supervisor about this, she was told that those cases were handled by senior prosecutors and were much more complicated to prove. This answer didn't satisfy Elena. She began spending her evenings in the law library, researching financial crimes and corruption cases. She learned about money laundering, bribery, tax evasion, and fraud schemes that cost taxpayers millions of dollars. She studied cases where wealthy defendants had hired teams of lawyers to find loopholes and delay trials until witnesses disappeared or evidence was lost. Elena also began to notice patterns in the local political scene. The same names appeared over and over again, on charity boards, in newspaper articles about business deals, and in photos from high society events. These people seemed to move in a circle that was separate from the rest of the city, protected by money and connections that ordinary citizens couldn't access. After graduating from law school and passing the bar exam, Elena was offered a job as a public defender. The pay was terrible and the workload was crushing, but it was exactly where Elena wanted to be. She would represent people who couldn't afford lawyers, fighting against prosecutors who often had more experience and better resources. Elena's first case was defending a teenage boy who had been caught stealing food from a grocery store. As she prepared for trial, Elena learned that the boy's family had been evicted from their apartment 2 weeks earlier and had been living in their car. His father had lost his construction job when the company he worked for went bankrupt, and his mother was working 2 minimum-wage jobs, but still couldn't make enough money to afford rent and food. Elena could have simply negotiated a plea deal. That would have gotten the boy probation and community service. Instead, she spent weeks investigating the construction company that had gone bankrupt, leaving dozens of workers without pay. She discovered that the company's owner had transferred millions of dollars to offshore accounts just before declaring bankruptcy, leaving his workers with nothing while he maintained his luxury lifestyle. Elena couldn't prosecute the construction company owner from her position as a public defender, but she made sure the information got to the right people. 6 months later, the man was arrested on charges of fraud and tax evasion. The teenage boy Elena had defended was able to get his father's back pay, and the family found stable housing. This case taught Elena an important lesson. Sometimes the best way to defend innocent people was to go after the powerful people who created the conditions that led to crime in the first place. She began to see connections between poverty, corruption, and crime that other lawyers missed or ignored. Over the next few years, Elena built a reputation as a public defender who didn't just defend her clients, she investigated the systems that had failed them. She traced drug addiction cases back to pharmaceutical companies that had knowingly created addictive medications. She connected domestic violence cases to employers who refused to provide living wages that would allow women to leave abusive relationships. Elena's work caught the attention of the district attorney, who offered her a job as a prosecutor. It was a big step up in pay and prestige, but Elena wasn't sure she wanted to switch sides. Thomas Chen stood in his doctor's office staring at the x-rays hanging on the light board. The dark spots on his lungs looked like storm clouds against the white background of his chest cavity. Dr. Williams was explaining something about treatment, options, and survival rates, but Thomas wasn't really listening. All he could think about was time, how much he had left, and what he needed to do with it. "How long?" Thomas asked, interrupting the doctor's careful explanation about chemotherapy and radiation. Dr. Williams paused, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question. "If you start treatment immediately, we might be able to give you 2, maybe 3 more years. Without treatment..." He trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. "Without treatment, how long?" Thomas pressed. 6 months, maybe 8 if you're lucky." Thomas nodded slowly. At 75 years old, he had lived longer than many people. He had seen his children grow up, marry, and have children of their own. He had built a successful business and earned the respect of everyone in his community. By most measures, he had lived a good life. But there was one thing he had never been able to forget. One secret that had eaten at him for nearly 3 decades. That night at Willow Lake. For 27 years, Thomas had carried the memory of what he had witnessed. He had saved a baby's life, but he had let the man who tried to kill her walk away free. Thomas had told himself he was protecting the child by staying quiet, giving her a chance to grow up without the shadow of that terrible night hanging over her. But as the years passed, his silence had felt more and more like cowardice. Thomas had followed the news about the baby he had saved. The newspapers had called her Baby Jane, and for months there had been stories about the search for her parents. Social services had appealed for information, police had investigated, but no one had ever come forward to claim her. Eventually, the story faded from the news, and Baby Jane disappeared into the foster care system. Over the years, Thomas had sometimes wondered what had happened to her. Had she found a good family? Was she happy? Did she ever think about that night at the lake? Or was she too young to remember? Thomas had been tempted many times to try to find out, but he had always stopped himself. What good would it do to bring up the past? But 3 months ago, something had changed Thomas's perspective completely. He had been reading the morning newspaper when he saw a story about a young prosecutor who had just won a major corruption case against a city council member. The prosecutor's name was Elena Rodriguez, and the article mentioned that she had been adopted as a baby after being found abandoned at Willow Lake. Thomas had stared at that newspaper for a long time, his coffee growing cold as he processed what he was reading. The baby he had saved had grown up to become a prosecutor. She was fighting corruption and crime, protecting innocent people from the kind of powerful criminals who thought they were above the law. And she had no idea that the man who had tried to kill her was still out there, probably still hurting people with his wealth and influence. Thomas had started following Elena's career after that. He read every newspaper article about her cases, watched her on the local news when she spoke at press conferences. What he saw impressed him and broke his heart at the same time. Elena had an intensity and passion for justice that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. She worked twice as hard as other prosecutors, took on cases that others avoided, and never gave up even when she was facing defendants with unlimited money and teams of expensive lawyers. Thomas began to understand that Elena's drive for justice wasn't just professional, it was personal. She was fighting against the kind of corruption and abuse of power that had nearly cost her life as a baby. She was protecting children and innocent people from predators and criminals. In a way, she was doing the work that Thomas should have done 27 years ago. The more Thomas learned about Elena, the more ashamed he became of his own silence. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to seeking truth and justice, and she was doing it without knowing the truth about her own life. She was fighting blind against an enemy she didn't even know existed. Thomas also began paying attention to Richard Blackwood, the man he had seen at the lake that night. Over the years, Blackwood had become even more powerful and wealthy. He had served as mayor for 2 terms, built a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and was now being mentioned as a possible candidate for governor. Blackwood appeared regularly in the society pages, attending charity galas and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. He was seen as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman who gave back to society. The contrast between Elena and Richard Blackwood made Thomas sick to his stomach. Elena had grown up in foster care, worked multiple jobs to pay for college, and struggled for every opportunity she had earned. She used her success to help other people and fight for justice. Meanwhile, Blackwood lived in luxury built on a foundation of lies and violence. He was praised and honored by people who had no idea what he was really capable of. Thomas knew that his cancer diagnosis was a sign that time was running out. If he was going to do something about what he had witnessed that night, it had to be soon. But he also knew that simply going to the police with his story might not be enough. It had been 27 years. He was an old man with cancer, and Blackwood was a powerful politician with connections throughout the legal system. Without solid evidence, it would be Thomas's word against Blackwood's, and Thomas knew who most people would believe. So Thomas decided to do something he had never done before. He hired a private investigator. The investigator, a former police detective named Carl Morrison, listened to Thomas's story with growing amazement. Carl had worked plenty of cold cases during his career, but nothing quite like this. A baby thrown into a lake by her own father, saved by a fisherman who kept quiet for nearly 3 decades, and now grown up to be a prosecutor fighting the same kind of corruption her father represented. You understand this is going to be almost impossible to prove after all this time, Carl warned Thomas. I don't need it to be easy, Thomas replied. I just need it to be done. Carl began his investigation by looking into Richard Blackwood's past, particularly the period around 1997, when the incident at the lake had occurred. He dug through old newspaper archives, court records, and business filings. He interviewed former employees of Blackwood's company and tracked down people who had known him during that time period. What Carl discovered was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond that one terrible night at Willow Lake. Over the years, Blackwood had used his wealth and influence to cover up scandals, silence accusers, and destroy anyone who threatened his reputation. He had bribed city officials to win construction contracts, intimidated witnesses in legal cases, and used private investigators to gather blackmail material on his enemies. Carl also investigated Elena's background, tracing her path through the foster care system, and her eventual adoption by the Hartwell family. He learned about her academic achievements, her work as a public defender, and her current role as a prosecutor. What struck Carl most was how Elena's career had focused so intensely on the very types of crimes that Blackwood had been committing for decades. The more Carl learned, the more convinced he became that this case was about more than just one act of violence from 27 years ago. Elena had unconsciously been preparing her entire career for this moment. She had developed exactly the skills and knowledge needed to take down someone like Richard Blackwood. But Carl also realized that Elena couldn't do it alone, and she couldn't do it without knowing the truth about her own past. The question was how to reveal that truth in a way that would give her the best chance of seeking justice, rather than just revenge. Carl suggested that Thomas approach Elena directly, but Thomas was reluctant. How do you tell someone that you witnessed their attempted murder as a baby and kept quiet about it for 27 years? How do you explain that the man who tried to kill her is now one of the most powerful people in the state? Instead, Thomas asked Carl to keep investigating and building a case file. If they could gather enough evidence to make prosecution possible, then Thomas would find a way to get that evidence to Elena. She deserved to know the truth, and more importantly, she deserved the chance to seek justice. As Thomas left Carl's office that day, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. For the first time since that night at Willow Lake, he believed that justice might finally be possible. The baby he had saved was now a woman with the power and skill to fight back against the man who had tried to destroy her. Thomas didn't know if he would live long enough to see Richard Blackwood face consequences for his crimes, but he was determined to give Elena every tool she needed to make that happen. The secret that had haunted him for 27 years was finally going to come to light, and the baby he had pulled from dark water was going to have her chance at justice. Thomas looked up at the sky as he walked to his truck, thinking about destiny and second chances. Sometimes he thought the universe had a way of making things right, even when it took nearly 3 decades to happen. Elena Rodriguez sat in her office late on a Thursday evening, reading through case files and preparing for the next day's court hearings. At 30 years old, she had just been appointed as a district court judge, the youngest person ever to hold that position in the state. The appointment had come after 5 years as a prosecutor, during which she had built a reputation for taking on cases that other attorneys avoided: complex corruption cases involving wealthy defendants who thought their money could buy them immunity from justice. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her concentration. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer it anyway. Judge Rodriguez speaking. Your Honor, my name is Carl Morrison. I'm a private investigator, and I have some information that I believe you need to hear. It's about your past, specifically about the night you were found at Willow Lake. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. In all her years growing up, she had wondered about that night, about how she had ended up alone at the lake as a newborn baby. The official story was that someone had found her floating in the water and called for help, but there had never been any details about who had saved her or how she had gotten there in the first place. I'm listening, Elena said carefully. I'd prefer to meet in person if that's possible. What I have to tell you is complicated, and there are some documents I think you should see. Something in Carl's voice told Elena this was serious. They arranged to meet the next evening at a coffee shop across town, away from the courthouse where Elena might be recognized. Elena spent the entire next day distracted, thinking about the phone call and wondering what Carl Morrison might know about her past. She had always felt like there was something missing from her life story, some piece of the puzzle that would explain why she felt so driven to seek justice, especially in cases involving crimes against children. That evening, Elena arrived at the coffee shop early and chose a table in the back corner where they could talk privately. Carl Morrison turned out to be a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who had spent years dealing with difficult truths. Thank you for meeting with me, Your Honor, Carl said as he sat down across from her. What I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to hear, but I believe you have a right to know. Carl opened a thick folder and placed a photograph on the table. It showed a younger man standing beside an expensive car at night, and though the image was grainy, Elena could make out the license plate number clearly. This photograph was taken on March 15, 1997, Carl said. The man in the picture is Richard Blackwood. I'm sure you know who he is. Elena nodded. Everyone in the state knew Richard Blackwood. He was one of the wealthiest men in the region, a former mayor who was now being talked about as a potential candidate for governor. His name appeared regularly in the newspapers, usually in connection with some charitable donation or business achievement. What does this have to do with me? Elena asked. Carl took a deep breath. Richard Blackwood is your biological father, and on the night this photograph was taken, he threw you into Willow Lake and left you to die. Elena stared at Carl, certain she had misheard him. That's impossible. I wish it were, Carl said gently. He placed another document on the table, a hospital record from March 1997, showing the birth of a baby girl to Maria Santos, with Richard Blackwood listed as the father. Your biological mother was Blackwood's secretary. When his wife found out about the affair and the pregnancy, she gave him an ultimatum. The problem had to disappear, or she would divorce him and destroy his reputation. Elena felt like the world was spinning around her. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her identity, was suddenly shifting. How do you know all this? Because there was a witness that night. A man named Thomas Chen was fishing at the lake when Blackwood arrived with you. Thomas saw everything. He watched Blackwood throw you into the water and then he saved your life. Carl pulled out more photographs, showing an older man with weathered hands and kind eyes. Thomas has carried this secret for 30 years. He's dying of cancer now, and he decided it was time for the truth to come out. He hired me to investigate and build a case. Elena's mind was racing. If this man Thomas saw everything, why didn't he go to the police 30 years ago? Because he was scared, Carl admitted. Thomas was a simple mechanic going up against one of the most powerful men in the city. He was afraid no one would believe him, and he was afraid of what Blackwood might do to him if he tried to speak out. But mostly, he wanted to protect you. He thought you'd be better off starting fresh with a new family, without the shadow of that night hanging over you. Elena understood that fear. In her years as a prosecutor, she had seen how wealth and influence could corrupt the justice system, how powerful people could escape consequences that would destroy ordinary citizens, but understanding didn't make it easier to accept. Where is Thomas now? She asked. He's in hospice care. The cancer has spread, and the doctors say he only has a few weeks left, but he wants to meet you if you're willing. He's been following your career for years. He's incredibly proud of what you've become. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. This stranger had saved her life and then spent 30 years watching from a distance as she grew up, never asking for recognition or thanks. Of course I want to meet him. Carl arranged for Elena to visit Thomas at the hospice facility the following weekend. When she walked into his room, Elena immediately recognized something familiar in his eyes, the same determination and kindness she had seen in David Hartwell, her adoptive father. Thomas was weak, but his voice was strong when he spoke. I've wanted to meet you for so long, he said. I've watched you become everything I hoped you would be when I pulled you out of that water. Elena sat beside his bed, holding his hand. Thank you for saving my life. But why didn't you tell anyone what really happened? Thomas smiled sadly. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I was protecting myself. I was afraid of Blackwood's power, afraid of what he might do if I spoke out. I let fear win, and I've regretted it every day since. You're not a coward, Elena said firmly. You risked your life to save mine. You could have just rode away and pretended you didn't see anything. But I let him get away with trying to murder you, Thomas replied. And he's gone on to hurt other people over the years. Carl has found evidence of bribes, cover-ups, intimidation. Blackwood has been using his wealth to corrupt the system for decades. Elena felt a familiar fire building in her chest, the same burning need for justice that had driven her entire career. Then we need to stop him. Over the next several weeks, Elena worked with Carl to review all the evidence Thomas had helped gather. There were financial records showing suspicious payments, witness statements about Blackwood's intimidation tactics, and most importantly, Thomas's detailed account of what had happened that night at Willow Lake. Elena also discovered that several of the corruption cases she had prosecuted as a prosecutor were connected to Blackwood's network. The city council members who had taken bribes, the police captain who had covered up crimes, the construction company owner who had stolen from city contracts, they were all part of a web of corruption that led back to Richard Blackwood. Elena knew she couldn't prosecute the case herself because of the obvious conflict of interest. Instead, she worked with the state attorney general's office to build an ironclad case against Blackwood. She provided them with all the evidence Thomas and Carl had gathered along with her own research into Blackwood's criminal network. The indictment came down on a Tuesday morning in November. Richard Blackwood was charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, bribery, tax evasion, and racketeering. The news sent shockwaves through the political and business communities. Blackwood supporters claimed the charges were politically motivated, but the evidence was overwhelming. Elena knew that Blackwood's lawyers would try every trick they could think of to get the charges dismissed or reduced. They would claim that too much time had passed, that witnesses were unreliable, that there wasn't enough evidence. But Elena had spent her entire career building cases against powerful defendants, and she knew this one would stick. The trial began 6 months later. Elena watched from the gallery as the prosecution laid out the case against her biological father. When Thomas took the stand, despite his weakened condition, his testimony was powerful and clear. He described that night at the lake in detail, explaining how he had saved Elena's life and why he had remained silent for so long. When Richard Blackwood was called to testify in his own defense, Elena finally got a close look at the man who had tried to kill her. He was older now, his hair white and his face lined with age, but she could see the arrogance and entitlement that had allowed him to believe he could commit murder and walk away. Blackwood denied everything, claiming he had never had an affair with Maria Santos and had never been at Willow Lake that night. But his lies crumbled under cross-examination when the prosecutor presented financial records showing payments to Maria during her pregnancy and photographs of Blackwood's car at the lake. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges.